The collective had ruled the stars for 12,000 years. Their empire stretched across 900 worlds and their ships darkened the skies of countless planets. No species had ever defeated them in battle. No species had ever refused their demands. When they wanted something, they took it. When they found a new world with intelligent life, they claimed it as their own. This was the way of the galaxy, and everyone accepted it as truth. Commander stood on the observation deck of the massive flagship called the Eternal Dominion. He was tall and thin with pale blue skin and 4 eyes that saw in spectrums humans could not imagine. He had served the collective for 300 years and had watched dozens of species bow before his people. Today would be no different. The sensors had found a small blue planet in an unremarkable solar system. The creatures there called themselves humans. They had only recently discovered how to split atoms, and their space vessels were laughably primitive. They would make adequate slaves or perhaps soldiers for the endless wars at the edges of the empire. The summoning beam was an ancient technology. It could reach across vast distances and pull ships through folded space in an instant. They used it to bring new species before them so they could see the power of the collective and understand their place in the grand order of things. Gave the order and the beam activated. It locked onto 3 vessels near the blue planet and pulled them through the void. The USS Dauntless tumbled through impossible space alongside her sister ship, the Relentless. A civilian research vessel called the Horizon had been caught in the field by accident. When the crews regained consciousness, they found themselves surrounded by 300 alien warships. The stars were wrong. The sun was gone. They were somewhere far from home. Captain Samuel Grant was 52 years old with grey hair and steady hands. He had served in the Navy for 30 years and had seen combat in waters around the world. Nothing had prepared him for this moment, but he did not let that show on his face. His crew looked to him for guidance, and he would give them what they needed. He stood from his command chair and straightened his uniform. Then he told his communications officer to open a channel to the alien vessels. They expected the humans to panic. Every species did when they first saw the power of the collective. They expected begging and pleading and offers of immediate surrender. Instead, they received something that confused them deeply. Captain Grant looked directly into the visual feed with calm eyes and spoke in a measured tone. He identified himself and his vessel. He stated that the aliens had committed an act of war against the people of Earth. He gave them exactly 1 hour to return the human ships to their home system and issue a formal apology. He said that if they failed to do this, then humanity would respond with appropriate force. Commander laughed. It was a strange sound that the translation system struggled to process. They had evolved beyond such emotional displays centuries ago, but this situation was simply too absurd. 3 tiny vessels surrounded by the might of the collective, and their captain was making demands. It was like watching an insect threaten a mountain. Replied with amusement in his voice. He called the human a small creature and said that he was entertaining. He explained that the human vessels were surrounded and their weapons could not penetrate shields. He offered 2 choices. The humans could serve the collective or they could cease to exist. There were no other options. Captain Grant listened carefully to every word. Then he slowly, as if he was thinking about a business proposal, he turned to his tactical officer and gave an order. Lieutenant Amy Turner was young and had never seen real combat. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked her console, but her voice was steady when she reported that weapons were locked on the alien flagship. They detected the targeting lock and found it amusing. Their shields could withstand the combined firepower of 1,000 primitive vessels. 3 ships with nuclear weapons posed no threat at all. Some of the officers on the bridge actually made sounds of amusement. This was going to be entertaining. On the horizon, the crew was terrified. They were scientists, not soldiers. Dr. Benjamin Cole was their leader, and he understood that they were all going to die unless someone did something unexpected. He had spent his career studying gravitational waves and theoretical physics. His mind raced through possibilities and landed on something that might work. It was untested and dangerous, but they had nothing to lose. He contacted Captain Grant on a secure channel and explained his theory. If they could generate a specific harmonic frequency, it might disrupt the energy patterns of the alien shields. It would only work for a moment, but a moment might be enough. Grant asked if Cole was certain it would work. Cole admitted that he was not certain at all. It might do nothing. It might destroy all of them. Grant was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that if they were going to die today, they would die fighting. That was not a failure. That was who they were. Commander on the Relentless had been listening to the conversation. She was a decade younger than Grant, but just as steady under pressure. She reported that her ship was ready and waiting for orders. Whatever they were going to do, she would be right beside them. The hour passed slowly. On the flagship, the officers watched the human vessels with curiosity. They wondered if the primitive creatures would attempt something foolish or simply accept their fate. Either way, the outcome was certain. The collective always won. That was the natural order of things. When the deadline arrived, Captain Grant did not hesitate. He gave the order to fire. Missiles streaked across the void toward the massive alien flagship. They watched them approach with complete confidence. Their shields had protected them from far more dangerous weapons. These primitive projectiles were nothing more than a minor annoyance. The missiles struck the shields, and for a moment nothing happened. Energy rippled across the barrier like waves on a pond. Then Dr. Cole activated his device. A pulse of gravitational energy spread outward from the horizon. It was a frequency that should not have existed according to science. It resonated with the shield generators at precisely the wrong wavelength. For exactly 1.5 seconds, the mighty shields of the flagship flickered and failed. One missile slipped through the gap, just one. It struck the hull of the Eternal Dominion and detonated with the fury of a small sun. Commander felt the deck shake beneath his feet. Alarms screamed throughout the ship. 3 decks were open to vacuum. 2,000 died in an instant. The collective had not lost so many soldiers in a single moment for over 1,000 years. Captain Grant's voice came over the open channel. It was still calm and measured, as if nothing unusual had happened. He told the aliens that this was their only warning. He repeated his demand that they return the human ships to Earth immediately. The galaxy would never be the same again. The explosion had torn through the flagship like a knife through paper. Smoke and fire filled the corridors as crew members rushed to contain the damage. Commander stood on his bridge and stared at the tactical display with all 4 of his eyes wide. This was impossible. The shields should have held. The primitive weapons should have done nothing. Yet 2,000 of his people were dead and his ship was crippled. He felt something stirring in his chest that he had not experienced in centuries. It was fear, real and primal and impossible to ignore. His ancestors had felt this emotion before they evolved beyond such weaknesses. Now it had returned and did not know how to process it. The other commanders in the fleet were sending urgent messages. They wanted to know what had happened. They wanted orders. They wanted someone to explain how 3 primitive vessels had damaged the most powerful ship in the collective armada. Pushed down his fear and gave the order to attack. 300 warships opened fire on the human vessels simultaneously. The void lit up with weapons fire as beams of energy and missiles and projectiles of every kind streaked toward the tiny ships. Captain Grant had expected this response. He had already given orders to his helmsman, and the Dauntless rolled hard to starboard as the first volley arrived. The ship shuddered as near misses rocked the hull, but the evasive kept them alive for precious seconds. The relentless dove beneath the firing line with Commander barking orders from her command chair. She had trained for combat her entire career, but nothing could have prepared her for this. 300 enemy ships, thousands of weapons, death coming from every direction. She refused to let her crew see her fear. They needed her to be strong. Lieutenant Turner worked her tactical console with frantic speed. Her training took over and her fingers moved almost without conscious thought. She found targets and fired. She tracked incoming missiles and deployed countermeasures. Her hands were shaking the entire time, but she never stopped fighting. The first hour was chaos. The human ships twisted and dodged through a storm of weapons fire that should have destroyed them 100 times over. They used the debris from the damaged flagship as cover. They flew in patterns that the computers could not predict. They fought with a desperation and creativity that the aliens had never seen before. Dr. Cole worked desperately on the horizon to keep his harmonic device functioning. The first activation had nearly burned out the power systems. He needed to recalibrate and repair and prepare for another attempt while the ship bucked and rolled around him. His assistants were terrified, but they followed his instructions without question. They all knew that the device was their only real advantage. Captain Grant coordinated the battle from the bridge of the Dauntless. His ship had taken heavy damage in the first exchange. Half of his weapons were offline and life support was failing on 3 decks. None of that mattered. What mattered was keeping his people alive and hurting the enemy as much as possible. He watched Lieutenant Turner destroy a fighter that had gotten too close, then another, then another. She was crying silently as she worked, but her aim was perfect. Grant felt a surge of pride for his young officer. This was her first real battle and she was performing like a veteran. The Relentless scored a direct hit on a cruiser. The ship exploded in a flash of light and debris. Commander allowed herself a grim smile before focusing on the next threat. 1 cruiser down, 299 ships to go. The battle stretched on for hours. The human ships took terrible damage. The Dauntless lost her main engines. The Relentless was leaking atmosphere from a dozen breaches. The Horizon had no weapons at all and relied entirely on the other ships for protection. But the humans kept fighting. They could not understand it. Their tactical models predicted that the primitive vessels should have surrendered long ago. Any rational species would have recognized the hopelessness of their situation and submitted. Yet these humans continued to resist with a ferocity that all logic. After 7 hours, the battle finally ended. The 3 human vessels drifted in a field of wreckage that included 42 destroyed ships. 42. The collective had not lost so many vessels in a single engagement in recorded history. Commander received casualty reports that made his blood run cold. 8,000 dead, dozens of ships damaged. The flagship would need months of repair before it could fight again. All of this from 3 primitive vessels that should have been utterly helpless. He ordered a temporary withdrawal to assess the situation. The remaining ships pulled back to a safe distance, and the firing stopped. In the silence that followed, the human crews began the desperate work of keeping their ships alive. Captain Grant was injured. A console had exploded near him during the battle and shrapnel had cut his arm deeply. The medic bandaged the wound while Grant continued to give orders. There was no time to rest. They needed to repair what they could and find a way home before the aliens regrouped. Dr. Cole made a discovery that changed everything. During the battle, the Horizon had captured fragments of transmissions and navigation data. Cole was able to decrypt some of this information and found what he needed: a course back to Earth. It would take weeks of travel through normal space, but it was possible. He shared this information with Grant, and on a secure channel, they agreed that escape was their only option. They could not survive another engagement, and the aliens would not stay back forever. They needed to warn Earth about what was coming. The 3 vessels limped away from the battlefield using what little engine power remained. They watched them go but did not pursue. They were too shocked by what had happened to think clearly. They needed time to understand this impossible defeat before they could plan their next move. It took the human ships 3 weeks to reach Earth. They arrived battered and broken with exhausted crews and failing systems, but they arrived, and they brought with them a warning that would change the course of human history. The aliens were real, they were powerful beyond imagination, and they were coming. Captain Grant delivered his report to the leaders of every nation. He showed them the footage from the battle. He explained what they wanted and what they were capable of. He told them that humanity had bought some time with blood and courage, but that time was limited. The world watched and listened and understood. They had always wondered if they were alone in the universe. Now they knew the answer. They were not alone, and the neighbors were hostile. For the first time in human history, the entire species faced a common enemy. Old hatreds and ancient conflicts suddenly seemed small and petty compared to the threat from the stars. Leaders who had never agreed on anything found common ground in survival. Humanity began to prepare for war. 5 years changed everything. The world that had been divided by borders and beliefs and old hatreds came together with a speed that surprised everyone. When the footage from the first battle spread across every screen on the planet, something shifted in the human spirit. People watched Captain Grant and his tiny fleet stand against impossible odds. They watched Lieutenant Turner destroy enemy fighters with tears on her face. They watched ordinary people refuse to surrender even when death was certain. And they understood. The United Earth Force was established within 6 months of the first contact. Every nation contributed whatever they could. Factories that had built cars and appliances now built warships. Universities that had studied abstract theories now worked on weapons and shields. Scientists who had spent their lives competing for grants now shared their knowledge freely because survival mattered more than glory. Captain Grant was promoted to admiral and given command of the entire force. He did not want the rank. He had never sought power or fame, but the world needed a symbol, and he understood that duty came before personal preference. His hair went completely white in those 5 years, but his eyes remained steady and calm. Commander became captain and was given the flagship of the new human fleet. The vessel was called the Indomitable, and it was the most advanced ship ever built by human hands. It combined everything humanity had learned from the wreckage of technology with the creativity and determination that defined the species. Engineers said it should not work. Physicists said it violated known laws. It worked anyway because humans had a talent for making impossible things real. Lieutenant Turner became Commander Turner and was placed in charge of the fighter wing aboard the Indomitable. She trained new pilots every day and pushed them harder than they thought possible. Some complained that she was too demanding. She did not care. She had seen what the enemy could do. She had watched friends die in the void. Her pilots would be ready or they would not fly. Dr. Cole continued his research on gravitational harmonics. The device that had saved them in the first battle was now the foundation of a new generation of shield technology. Human ships could generate defensive barriers that even weapons struggled to penetrate. It was not enough to guarantee victory, but it gave them a chance. The shipyards worked around the clock. 200 vessels were completed in 5 years, destroyers and cruisers and carriers and fighters, each one crewed by volunteers who understood what they were signing up for. The pay was average, the risk was total, The recruitment offices never had empty chairs. Admiral Grant spent his days reviewing tactics and his nights studying technology. He slept 4 hours when he slept at all. His wife told him he was killing himself. He told her that rest could wait until Earth was safe. She understood even if she hated it. Captain drilled her crew relentlessly. The Indomitable ran combat simulations every day. They practiced until their responses were automatic. They learned to fight as a single organism where every person knew exactly what to do without being told, demanded perfection because anything less would get them killed. Commander Turner lost 3 pilots in training accidents. Each death hit her hard, but she did not soften her methods. Better to lose a few in practice than to lose everyone when the real battle came. She wrote letters to the families herself. She told them their children had been brave. She did not tell them about the nightmares that still woke her every night. Dr. Cole made a breakthrough in the 4th year. He discovered a way to amplify the harmonic pulse and extend its range. In theory, the new device could disable an entire enemy fleet at once. In practice, it had never been tested on that scale. There was no way to test it until the moment it was needed. When the return they came with overwhelming force. 3,000 warships emerged from folded space at the edge of the solar system. The collective had decided that humanity was too dangerous to enslave. These creatures would be exterminated completely. Their planet would be burned. Their history would be erased. No trace would remain to inspire other species to resist. Supreme Commander Eth led the armada from the new flagship. He was ancient even by standards. He had conquered 100 worlds and crushed 1,000 rebellions. He had studied the footage from the first battle and developed countermeasures for every human tactic. This time there would be no surprises. The human fleet waited for them at the edge of the solar system, 200 vessels against 3,000. The math was terrible, the odds were worse. None of that mattered because retreat was not an option. Earth was behind them, everything they loved was behind them. They would hold the line or die trying. Admiral Grant addressed the fleet on an open channel. His voice was calm and steady as it had always been. He told them that 5 years ago humanity had been pulled from their home by an empire that saw them as insects. Today they stood as defenders of their world and their species. He acknowledged that some of them would not survive the coming battle. That was the nature of war, but he wanted each of them to know that every moment they fought mattered. Every breath they took in defiance of the invaders mattered. Their courage would be remembered for as long as humans drew breath. He finished with a simple command: show them what we are made of. The second battle for Earth began with fire and fury. Weapons blazed across the void as the human fleet surged forward to meet them. The first ships died within seconds. The survivors kept coming. They had nowhere else to go. Captain pushed the Indomitable into the heart of the enemy formation. Her shields flared under constant bombardment, but they held. Commander Turner led her fighters in a screening action that cost 12 pilots their lives in the first 10 minutes. Dr. Cole monitored his device and waited for the right moment. Admiral Grant watched the tactical display and made the calculations that no one else wanted to make. How many ships could they lose and still have a chance? How long could they hold? Where to commit reserves? When to fall back? The weight of every death pressed down on him, but he did not let it show. The battle raged for hours. The human fleet was being destroyed piece by piece, but they were making the enemy pay for every victory. Ships exploded, soldiers died. The price of conquering humanity was becoming very high indeed. Supreme Commander Eth watched his casualty reports with growing unease. He had expected quick victory. Instead, he was locked in a grinding battle against enemies who simply refused to accept defeat. The humans were wounded and outnumbered and dying, but they were still fighting. The battle had been raging for 6 hours and the situation was desperate. The human fleet had been reduced from 200 vessels to less than 90. Wreckage filled the void between the stars. Escape pods drifted among the debris carrying survivors who might never be rescued. They had lost ships as well, but they had thousands more to spare. The math was simple and brutal. Humanity was losing. Admiral Grant transferred from ship to ship as his command vessels were destroyed. The cruiser Defiant lasted 2 hours before a torpedo tore through her engineering section. The destroyer Valiant survived for another hour before her shields finally failed. Now Grant commanded from a damaged frigate called the Swift. It was the smallest combat vessel in the fleet, and it was falling apart around him. Captain refused to retreat. The Indomitable had taken terrible punishment, but she kept the ship fighting through sheer force of will. When the main weapons array was destroyed, she ordered her engineers to reroute power through secondary systems. When those failed, she had them connect directly to the reactor core. Her chief engineer warned that this could cause a catastrophic feedback loop, replied that if they exploded, she wanted to do it in the middle of the enemy formation. Commander Turner had lost most of her pilots. 60 fighters had launched at the start of the battle. 11 remained. She had watched friends die one by one. Their distress calls had echoed in her helmet until they went silent. Each death carved a new wound in her soul, but she kept flying. There was nothing else to do. Surrender meant extinction. Dr. Cole worked frantically aboard the Horizon II, trying to finish calibrating his harmonic weapon. The device could theoretically disable the entire fleet at once, but it needed more power than the ship could safely provide. He was making modifications that no sane engineer would approve. The risk of destroying his own vessel was significant. The alternative was watching humanity die. Supreme Commander Eth pressed his advantage without mercy. His flagship, the Eternal Dominion, pushed toward Earth at the head of a massive formation. Nothing would stop him from reaching that blue planet and burning it clean. The humans had the collective. They had embarrassed his people across the galaxy. They would pay for that insult with their extinction. The human line buckled under the pressure. Ships died, then Grant could track them. The tactical display was a nightmare of red icons and warning signals. Communications were breaking down. Coordination was failing. The fleet was coming apart. Grant looked at the situation and made a decision that would either save humanity or destroy what remained of it. He opened a channel to every surviving ship. His voice was tired but steady. He told his people that they were going to try something that had no official name because no one had ever been desperate enough to attempt it. They were going to charge directly at the enemy flagship. Every ship, every fighter, every weapon they had left. They would either break the enemy or die trying. There was no retreat. There was no surrender. There was only this moment and what they chose to do with it. Captain acknowledged the order without hesitation. She pointed the Indomitable at the Eternal Dominion and pushed her engines past their safety limits. Commander Turner gathered her 11 remaining pilots and led them toward the enemy formation. Dr. Cole made final adjustments to his device and hoped that it would work when the moment came. The human fleet surged forward in a final desperate charge. They could not understand what they were seeing. Their tactical computers analyzed the human and produced results that made no sense. No rational species would deliberately throw themselves into certain destruction. It violated every principle of self-preservation. It contradicted every evolutionary imperative that governed intelligent life. They did not understand that humans had words for this: sacrifice, courage, defiance, love. The charge cost humanity terribly. 23 vessels were destroyed in the first wave. Brave crews died knowing that their deaths would buy seconds for their comrades. Fighters exploded as they shielded larger ships from enemy fire. The void became a graveyard of twisted metal and frozen bodies. But the humans reached the flagship. They swarmed around the Eternal Dominion like hornets defending their hive. Small ships dodged between the massive vessel's weapons and struck at vulnerable points. Fighters launched missiles at point-blank range. The Indomitable rammed through a defensive screen and opened fire on the flagship's engine section. Supreme Commander Eth felt something he had not experienced in centuries: panic, real and overwhelming panic. These creatures were insane. They were throwing their lives away with reckless abandon. They were dying by the hundreds, and they kept coming. Admiral Grant's frigate took a direct hit that killed half the crew. The ship was dying around him. He ordered the helmsman to ram the flagship if all weapons failed. The helmsman acknowledged without hesitation. Captain's ship was on fire in 3 sections. Life support was failing. Her arm was broken from a console explosion. She refused to leave the bridge. She had made a promise to defend Earth, and she would keep that promise until her last breath. Commander Turner ran out of missiles. She flew her fighter directly into a gun emplacement and ejected at the last second. The explosion took out the weapon and 2 others nearby. Her ejection pod drifted in the chaos while she waited to see if rescue would come. Dr. Cole watched his power readings climb into the red zone. The device was ready. It might work. It might destroy everything. There was only one way to find out. He activated the harmonic pulse. A wave of gravitational disruption spread outward from the Horizon II at the speed of light. It passed through every ship simultaneously. It resonated with their power systems at precisely the wrong frequency. Shield generators overloaded. Engines stuttered and died. Weapons went dark. For 47 seconds, the entire fleet was helpless. The surviving human vessels did not hesitate. They had been fighting for hours. They were exhausted and wounded and running on nothing but adrenaline and pure stubborn will. They unleashed everything they had left. The Eternal Dominion took 17 direct hits in those 47 seconds. Her hull breached in multiple locations. Her reactor began to fail. The greatest warship in the collective armada was dying. Supreme Commander Eth stared at his tactical display and watched his empire crumble around him. The 47 seconds changed the course of galactic history. When the harmonic pulse faded and systems began to recover, they found a very different battlefield. 1,400 of their ships were destroyed or crippled beyond repair. Another 800 had taken severe damage. The mighty armada that had come to exterminate humanity was broken. Supreme Commander Eth received damage reports from across his fleet. The numbers were impossible. The casualties were catastrophic. His people had ruled the stars for 12,000 years. They had conquered species beyond counting. They had never known defeat on this scale. He looked at the tactical display and saw the surviving human vessels. Less than 50 ships remained. Most were heavily damaged. Some were barely functional. They drifted in the wreckage of the battle, surrounded by the bodies of their fallen comrades. By any reasonable measure, the humans were finished. But they were still there, still fighting, still refusing to surrender. Eth understood something in that moment that changed him forever. The humans were not just primitive creatures who fought well. They were something the galaxy had never seen before. A species forged in constant struggle, tempered by endless conflict, unable to accept defeat even when defeat was the only logical outcome. They were a weapon, the most dangerous weapon the universe had ever produced, and the collective had been foolish enough to point that weapon at themselves. The aide at his side reported that the human flagship was still operational. It was requesting an open channel. Eth hesitated for a long moment, then he gave the order to accept the communication. Admiral Grant's face appeared on the screen. He was injured and exhausted. Blood ran from a cut on his forehead. His uniform was torn and stained, but his eyes were clear and his voice was steady. He looked like a man who had walked through hell and come out the other side still standing. Eth spoke first. He told the human that they would withdraw. Their system would remain theirs. The collective would not return. Grant slowly, he accepted these terms, but he said there was one more thing. Eth asked what more could possibly be demanded. Grant explained that the collective's practice of summoning and enslaving lesser species would end immediately. All species currently under control would be released. They would be provided with the means to return to their. Never again would the collective treat sentient beings as property. The demand hung in the silence between them. Eth wanted to refuse. Every instinct screamed at him to reject this humiliation. The collective had owned slaves for millennia. It was the foundation of their economy and their power. Agreeing to this demand would change everything. But he looked at the wreckage of his fleet. He counted the dead. He remembered how close the humans had come to destroying him despite being outnumbered 30 to 1, and he imagined what would happen if he refused. The humans would come for them, not today, perhaps not for years, but eventually they would come, and when they arrived they would not stop until the collective was nothing but a memory. They were that stubborn, they were that dangerous, they were that impossible to break. Eth agreed to the terms. The channel closed and the fleet began its long retreat. Ships that had traveled across the galaxy to destroy a primitive species now limped home in defeat. Their commanders were silent, their crews were shocked. The universe they had known no longer existed. On Earth, people watched the alien armada disappear from their senses. For a long moment no one spoke. Then the cheering began. It spread from mission control to cities and towns across the planet. People who had been holding their breath for hours finally let themselves believe that they had survived. Admiral Grant stood on the observation deck of the battered frigate and looked out at the stars. Captain joined him. Her arm was in a sling and her face was covered in burns, but she was smiling. They had won. Against all odds and all logic, they had won. Said the words out loud as if testing whether they were real. We won. Grant considered her statement carefully. Then he replied that they had survived. That was not always the same thing as winning. She asked what would happen now. Grant thought about the question. Out there beyond the light of their sun, thousands of enslaved species were about to receive their freedom. The galaxy would learn what had happened here. They would learn about the small blue planet that had stood against the masters of the Orion arm and refused to break. Stories would spread. Legends would grow. He told that now they would rebuild. They would their dead. And they would make certain that no one ever underestimated humanity again. Commander Turner was rescued from her escape pod after drifting for 3 hours. She was brought aboard the Indomitable and taken to the medical bay. The doctors wanted her to rest, but she refused. She needed to see the other survivors. She needed to know who had made it. 11 pilots had survived from her original 60. Each of them had stories of impossible escapes and desperate battles. Each of them carried wounds both visible and hidden. They gathered in the ready room and sat in silence for a long time. Words seemed inadequate for what they had experienced. Dr. Cole was already working on refinements to his harmonic technology. The device had saved them, but it had also nearly destroyed his ship. There would be other threats and other battles. Humanity needed to be ready for whatever came next. The news spread across the galaxy than anyone expected. They had been defeated by a species that had barely discovered space travel. The masters of the Orion arm had been humbled by creatures they had dismissed as primitives. Enslaved species heard the story and began to dream of freedom. Other empires heard the story and began to worry. A new power had risen among the stars. They were small and young, and they had much to learn, but they had proven something that would echo across the centuries to come. When summoned, humanity did not kneel. When threatened, humanity fought back. And when pushed to the breaking point, humanity broke something else instead. They had wanted to find a new servant species. They had found something very different. They had awakened a sleeping predator. They had challenged a species that had spent its entire existence fighting against impossible odds. They had summoned humanity, and the galaxy would never be the same again.